Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back to Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world. Today we delve into the life and crimes of serial killer Herbert Mullin, a deeply disturbed man who roamed the redwoods and beaches of Santa Cruz with voices in his head telling him he must kill in order to save California from an imminent earthquake, leaving 13 corpses in his horrible wake. Yes, step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and behold the gruesome and horrible tale of Herbert William Mullin.
Let's begin. Prologue. The Mystery Spot. A darkness had fallen over Santa Cruz, California, after the brutal massacre of the Otah family in 1970, sparking a cultural war between the hippies and the straights. What had once been a quiet and conservative beach community became a place of death and carnage. People were going missing, some of whom have never been accounted for. Body parts were washing up on the pristine beaches. Mutilated corpses were found in the redwoods.
And besides all the murders, there was a serial rapist at work who has never been identified to this day.
On February 6th, a 16-year-old boy named Wilfred Brown left Jean Dawson's Drug Abuse Preventative Center to sell soap door-to-door for a fundraiser, and went to the home of Ida Stein. She invited him in, asked if he'd like some cookies, offered to pray with him. He raped her and drowned her in her own bathtub. A beloved local hobo was beaten to death with a baseball bat right on the side of the road. In St. Mary's Catholic Church, a priest was stabbed to death in the confessional booth. Random people were being shot dead with no warning or any apparent motive. And butchered remains, decapitated heads, and body parts were turning up everywhere. It was utter insanity. What was going on? And then there was a call about a young mother and her two sons, 19, 14, who were found murdered, shot to death, in a cabin by the Mystery Spot, an iconic tourist destination in the redwoods.
Ah, the Mystery Spot. The Mystery Spot, which is billed as a gravitational anomaly, is basically just a shack that leans at an angle so that your perception is thrown off, and you're seemingly able to stand at 45-degree angles, and it appears that balls roll up hills. While being billed as possibly as an ancient guidance system for spacecraft, or perhaps a buried spaceship itself, or as, quote, the highest dialect biocosmic radiation known in the world, whatever that means. It's really just an optical illusion. They were called tilt boxes back in the day, and we have our own up here in Humboldt County called Confusion Hill. But ours has a train ride up into the redwoods as well. They're just fun little tourist traps. We used to say the most confusing thing about Confusion Hill is why we'd always go there and give them money. But I love weird little tourist traps like this. It kind of gives a Captain Spaulding's Museum of Monsters and Madmen from House of a Thousand Corpses vibe.
That same day, just miles away, a husband and wife would also be found shot to death in their little cabin. At a press conference about all the killings that evening, a reporter for the San Francisco Examiner asked District Attorney Peter Chang, quote, "Would you say that Santa Cruz is the murder capital of the world?" End quote.
The answer the district attorney gave would reverberate around the world with news clips and headlines be posted and talked about for years, eventually making its way into a vampire film? His answer was, right now, Santa Cruz must be the murder capital of the world.
And in fact, besides the random killings and the rapist, and the murders by John Frazier years earlier, the truth was there was not one but two serial killers at work in Santa Cruz, one of whom was a man in deep psychosis, who thought his killing spree was delaying a predicted cataclysmic earthquake where California would crumble into the sea.
And that man's name was Herbert William Mullin.
Chapter 1. Little Herbie. Herbert Mullin was born April 18, 1947, in Boulder Creek, California, a small rural town in the Santa Cruz Mountains where his parents had a summer home. The Mullins were a very strict Catholic family, and Herbert's father, William, had been a drill sergeant in the Marines. And while a loving father, it is said he raised his son like a soldier.
Herb grew up in San Francisco, attending Archbishop Reardon Catholic School. He was an altar boy and a Boy Scout. Friends describe him as a, quote, serious, straight arrow kind of kid. He was bright and athletic, playing on the Little League team.
Like many of the serial killers from the 70s, his father had been in World War II and suffered PTSD, or as they called it back then, shell shock. But though he could be strict, he never beat Herbie and did his best to be a good father, becoming a scoutmaster when Herb showed an interest in the Boy Scouts. And while his mother was said to be deeply religious and a fervent Catholic, she is also said to have been kind and loving, a good, tolerant mother.
When Herb was 16, his father, who worked for the post office, was offered a promotion in Felton, a small town in Santa Cruz County, about 16 miles from the beach. So the family moved south, and Herb transferred into San Lorenzo Valley High School, working part-time at Johnny's Supermarket. He had a high school sweetheart named Loretta Ricketts, and he played on the varsity football team where he was number 72. He was on the first-string offense with his best friend, Dean Richardson.
It was really like something out of that old TV show, Happy Days or something. Herb says,
there was a root beer hamburger drive-in in Felton, about a mile from the high school. We would meet there to have burgers and French fries after school, and then go to our football practice.
Herbie would later say about his best friend, Dean,
we hiked together in the redwood forests all around Boulder Creek. We swam together and played one-on-one basketball together. I enjoyed playing one-to-one catch, mitts, and hardball. He was good at that. What did Dean mean to me? I admired his athletic prowess. It wasn't a love relationship. We were only good friends.
But it's speculated their relationship might have been more than friends, or perhaps friends with benefits. At the very least, Herb was somewhat in love with his friend, and it may have sprouted his bisexuality, which confused him.
Herb's father had been a boxer, and he trained Herb to box as well. Herbert Mullin was an intelligent, athletic, clean-cut, all-American teenager and graduated high school in 1965 at the top of his class and was voted most likely to succeed. His best friend Dean was voted most athletic.
Herb and Dean planned to live in a cabin together after graduation, but Herb's parents forbade it, saying he wasn't ready to live on his own.
And then tragedy struck. Dean Richardson was with his friend Jerry Bishop, driving up Graham Hill, headed to Santa Cruz to pick up a girl for a dance. Jerry was driving, speeding, as teenagers do, and like a scene out of Rebel Without a Cause, slammed into a redwood tree, killing both Jerry and Dean.
Dean's death was a tragic blow to Herb, He cried for days, went into an utter breakdown, building giant, elaborate shrines in his room composed of photographs and trinkets. Shrines he claims voices demanded he build. He was utterly devastated, inconsolable, and friends say something changed in him afterward.
And he blamed his parents for his friend's death, thinking if they just allowed them to get a cabin together, Dean would not have been in that car that night.
Herb himself would say,
"My mental health, emotional health became a very big problem after his passing. I feel that he was on the verge of helping me get away from my parents' negative influence. That opportunity vanished when he passed."
Chapter 2: Herbie and the Swinging 60s. 1965 was a pivotal moment in Santa Cruz, the college opening that year, drawing in a lot of academics and free thinkers, the culture changing from an elderly, conservative mindset into a young and liberal outlook. It was also a pivotal time in the world. 3,500 United States Marines were sent to Da Nang that year, becoming the first American ground troops in Vietnam, and the United States Air Force began what would become a 3.5-year bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder. By the end of the year, there was a draft in effect.
Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. led a successful 25,000-person 4-day march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. After the first march, led by John Lewis, ended after the sheriff deputized every white man over the age of 21 in the county and had them attack the peaceful marchers live on television. The world watching horrified as innocent civil rights advocates were mercilessly beaten with clubs. John Lewis's skull fractured, 50 marchers injured, 17 hospitalized with severe injuries, one left in a coma.
1965 also saw the assassination of Malcolm X.
And this is the world Herbert Mullin was graduating from high school into. It's one of the craziest cultural upheavals in history, from civil rights and feminism to the sexual revolution and the anti-war movement.
But Herb was a very straight young man. He was really handsome then, too, though you can watch his looks diminish in photographs as mental illness began to take its hold over him. But in 1965, 18-year-old Herbert Mullin was a bright, square-jawed, all-American boy.
He went to Cabrillo, the local community college. Very cool place, still there. I actually know a lot of people who went to school there. And he worked as an engineering aide for the Santa Cruz County Department of Works. He got engaged to his high school sweetie, Loretta, but then, hanging out on the beach one day with his buddy Jim Gianera, he smoked a joint, something he would later blame as the beginning of the downfall of his life. The killer weed will get you and lead you to a life of debauchery. Watch out.
As Herb puffed on his first joint, the waves crashing, seagulls squalling, he discovered he liked it. Liked it a lot. And soon he was experimenting with LSD, which, by the way, was completely legal at that time. It wouldn't be until October of 1968, years later, that it was made an illegal substance.
Herb and Loretta began having sex, and Herb became disillusioned with the Catholic Church because when he confessed his sins, the priest kept telling him what a terrible sin he was committing by having premarital sex and telling him not to do it again. But they were in love, and it was the 60s. He started studying Hinduism and got into yoga and meditation.
In June of 1967, Herbert graduated from Cabrillo with an Associate of Science and over 6 units of credit he could use for his bachelor's degree. And he started classes at San Jose State University, staying with his sister who had moved to Sebastopol. Here, he became obsessed with the Vietnam War.
As I'm sure every young person was, and there was an active draft. Herb decided to register as a conscientious objector, saying he could not support the war, stating both his Catholic faith, including his time as an altar boy, and his spiritual studies with Eastern religions.
He spent 10 months going to the draft board and filling out forms, meeting with person after person, obviously being ridiculed and belittled along the way. 1967 was not a good time to be anti-war. He was encouraged to join a medical unit where he wouldn't have to fight, but he said he objected to the war and couldn't be a part of it in any way.
I think a good bit of his strong anti-war stance might have been straight rebellion from his father, who, remember, had been a drill sergeant in the Marines and was a World War II veteran and had run their household in a military fashion.
It's around this time that Herb's mental illness began to really reveal itself. Schizophrenia is a horrible disease that often manifests itself in early adulthood. Herb had been an excellent student and athlete, was engaged in college, had a bright future ahead of him, but as the synapses in his brain started misfiring, he quit school and moved back down to his parents' house.
Unfortunately, he exacerbated his mental illness by taking acid and smoking weed all night, most likely maybe trying to self-medicate. And he'd later claim that LSD was much better at helping him with his schizophrenia than the antipsychotic medications he would eventually be prescribed.
One day, while high out of his mind on acid, he was invited to a cabin in the middle of the woods with a Catholic priest named Father John O'Connell.
Can you guess what happened? In the middle of the night, the priest climbed into his bed naked and began to molest him. This same priest would later strongly deny these accusations. But guess what? In 2002, Father John O'Connell was removed from active ministry after lawsuits of improper contact with underage boys. So I don't know who you're going to believe. I kind of believe the serial killer over the disgraced priest, but...
Just to be clear, Herbert Mullin would have been 21 years old at this point. He wasn't a child, but there are indications, according to some, that a similar thing may have happened to him when he was an altar boy, and that he had been secretly harboring an attraction to men for some time, in particular his high school best friend, Dean Richardson.
But according to him, this homosexual encounter with a priest just really, really messed his head up, awakening something, especially as he kind of liked it. He began to declare himself bisexual to folks. He shaved his head and actually broke up with his fiancée. He kind of gets a boyfriend, an old friend named Ed Lawrence. Ed said that Herbert would become so overcome with guilt over his homosexuality that several times when they were just casually discussing sex, Herb would pull down his pants and burn his penis with a cigarette.
Herb's parents had a little party the night of their anniversary. His sister was there with her husband, Al. As they sat around the dining room table, sipping wine and eating, they began to notice that Herb was mimicking Al, copying his every move and gesture. Al picks up his fork, stabs at a piece of turkey. Herb picks up his fork, stabs at a piece of turkey. Al takes a sip of wine. Herb takes a sip of wine. Al smiles and laughs at a joke. Herb smiles and laughs at a joke. Al starts to speak. Herb starts to speak. It went on for hours.
It's a condition known as echopraxia, the involuntary mimicking of others, often a sign of schizophrenia, but also a symptom of Tourette's as well.
After mimicking Al for hours, Herb eventually fell into a complete stupor, utterly uncommunicative. His family describes it as if he were in a coma. He just sat there, unresponsive, seemingly unable to move. Finally, his family was able to get him up to his feet and to his bedroom and to bed.
The next day, Herb's father goes to, wait for it, the same Catholic priest that had basically date raped him. And Father O'Connell says, "Take that boy to the mental hospital. He's plumb crazy." And he is sent to the Mendocino State Health Hospital.
No exorcism. How boring.
The Mendocino State Health Hospital was over 200 miles away up the coast. And I'm guessing that priest wanted him as far the fuck away from him as possible. I mean, you literally have to drive past San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland to get there, not to mention Santa Rosa. Like, they really sent him to the middle of nowhere.
The Mendocino State Health Hospital examines him and then declares him, quote, schizophrenic, chronic, undifferentiated type 22.5, manifested by distortion of associations and affect and hallucinations, impairment severe.
And Herb was developing all kinds of strange psychoses, but he refused to believe he was schizophrenic, saying instead that he was on the verge of a great revelation from God. He also got bizarre notions of sex and became incredibly angry with his parents for not teaching him about sex at a younger age. It's nuts. He came to believe that nearly everyone was having sex from an extremely young age, and all this had been kept a secret from him, and that he'd been deprived of the sex-filled childhood that the rest of the world experienced. He convinced himself that his father was gay and that his sister and mother were lesbians who'd been carrying on a sexual affair since his sister was a child. And he deeply resented this, thinking he'd been kept from experiencing the pleasures of sex.
In March of 1969, Herb was allowed to check himself out of the hospital.
There was actually a movement at the time called deinstitutionalizing, brought about by then Governor Ronald Reagan, who stopped all funding for state mental health institutions in order to save money and help balance the budget. You know, interestingly, the Nazis did the same exact thing when they got into power, cutting back on what they saw waste. Only the Nazis sent the mentally ill to concentration camps. Ronald Reagan just dumped them out onto the streets of California. And another mental patient who had murdered his grandparents as a minor was also discharged from the Atascadero State Mental Hospital. His name was Edmund Kemper, and he was now in Santa Cruz as well, leaving decapitated heads and body parts all over the place. But we'll get to him.
So Herb just goes right to Sebastopol, to his sister's trailer, telling her how angry he was that their parents hadn't taught him about sex at a younger age, then asking her if she'd like to have sex with him. Ew. When his sister disgustedly said she was not going to have sex with him, Herb went to her husband, the guy he'd been mimicking at his parents' party, and asked him if he'd like to have sex. He obviously declined his advances as well.
It was an uncool scene, man. Uncool. And Herb was asked to leave. So he headed over to Lake Tahoe for a while, washing dishes at Harvey's Wagon Wheel, but was soon back in his hometown of Santa Cruz.
Back in Santa Cruz, it was the summer of 1969. Herb was again a free spirit in the wild, hippie underworld. He was eating acid, hanging out with all the freaks, doing yoga on the beach, experimenting with his bisexuality.
It was kind of peak hippie life, those last moments before the Manson family brought it all crashing down and no one would ever trust a hippie again.
Herb went and hung out on a commune in the hills called the Holiday Commune.
I think it was called the Holiday Commune because it was made up of these little holiday cabins. You know, like little tiny studio rentals in the redwoods. Folks would holiday in the 30s and 40s, but they were all dilapidated and falling down now. So an Australian hippie magazine called Revolution went out to the Holiday Commune in 1970 and wrote an article about the place. You ready to hear this?
I am so ready to hear it. What do we got?
All right, quote, Revolution magazine, 1970. Holiday is a commune where the inhabitants practice nudity and live in comfortable bungalows. The drugs most widely used appeared to be marijuana, opiated hashish, and methamphetamine, aka speed. I gotta throw that in there in case you didn't know. Of the 10 girls living in Holiday, 6 were pregnant, Polyamorous relationships are common, and children are regarded as children of the commune. A newcomer is asked not for his name, but for his birth sign. Most of the inhabitants have an extremely superficial understanding of astrology, yet take paranormal planetary influence upon human behavior for granted. The newcomer's birth sign seems to be used as a means to pigeonhole the strange and as a base of which to initiate or avoid a relationship.
Later, it was said that the commune became so rat-infested and trashed that they cleared everyone out and just burned all the cabins to the ground.
At the commune, usually a place of tolerance and understanding, Herb quickly became a pariah, making unwanted sexual advances on the women. So much for free love, I guess. He actually went into the cabin of an Asian woman and offered to impregnate her so she could have a, quote, biracial child. It's an odd way of...
Yeah, the commune was not amused with his antics. You can find two different versions of this story. In one, Herb and a crazy hippie girl, who was said to be as crazy as he was, fell in love and flew off to Hawaii together. In another version, the commune had the girl take Herb to Hawaii under false pretenses, tricking him as a means of getting him away from them. But either way, once in Hawaii, the girl quickly abandoned Herb, and it was then that Herbert Mullin started using crystal methamphetamine, which he said helped his mental illness even better than LSD.
But, as you may guess, methamphetamine is not good for mental illness. And Herb found himself briefly institutionalized in a mental hospital in Hawaii. Eventually, he was discharged and asked his father for a plane ticket back to California.
Herb worked at a Goodwill in San Luis Obispo for a while, which the military considered public service, a requirement of his conscientious objector status. There he confided to his boss how God commanded him to burn his penis with a cigarette, because that's where the voices in his head come from.
Then Herb attempted to have sex with his boss, which the man did not appreciate, and resulted in him being briefly institutionalized again in October of 1969.
After this, Herb goes and gets some tattoos.
And you know what? I have to admit, these are some pretty badass fucking tattoos. In huge block letters across his belly, you know, like the old school kind of gang style, he gets legalize acid. And below that, he gets eagle eye marijuana.
Oh boy. But as we've stated, large amounts of psychedelic drugs are not good for mental health issues, and he began to spin out of control. He took to wandering the hills of Santa Cruz with a huge Bowie knife strapped to his side, much like last week's killer John Linley Frazier, and got into a fight with a forest ranger out in the middle of the woods on protected land that he was trespassing on. Herb then tried to stab the guy. He was subdued and escorted off the property, but let go with a warning and no charges.
He was then picked up by the police, walking down the street, screaming at himself, and exposing his penis to passerby, presumably showing off all the cool cigarette burns. I don't know. But he was 5150, which means they had held him in a psychiatric unit for 72 hours and then released him. The police report read,
"As a result of a mental disorder, he is a danger to others, a danger to himself, and gravely disabled."
Then he got picked up smoking a joint and was arrested for possession of marijuana. And during the hearing, began screaming at the judge, saying, "Weed and LSD should be legalized. You're violating my civil rights."
The judge, seeing that he was obviously in a state of psychosis, committed him to the local emergency mental ward. He was held for 72 hours and released.
He moved to San Francisco in 1971, moving into the infamous Tenderloin district, where he terrified his roommate as he had violent and passionate arguments with God about the nature of creation.
In San Francisco, he began boxing in Golden Gloves tournaments, and he was really good. Remember, his father had been a boxer and taught him how to fight as a child.
But during one fight, he hit his opponent with a good left hook, and when the guy fell to the ground, Herb leapt atop him and started pummeling him in the face. People had to leap into the ring and pull Herb off the guy, and he was kicked out of the league for that incident.
It was around this time that Herb became obsessed with earthquakes.
So when you read about this case, you hear that scientists were predicting a big earthquake, which is totally not true at all. Seismologists all admit that there's no way to predict an earthquake. What happened was there was this eccentric mathematician named Reuben Greenspan who had actually predicted earthquakes way back in the 1930s, saying he had matched tidal data to the positions of the moon, sun, and stars. And he actually did predict a couple of earthquakes, but actual scientists scoffed at this, saying he just got lucky. But in 1972, this guy, he's now 67 years old, and like some kind of old school prophet, he comes out of a hermitage in the Arizona desert and predicts that San Francisco would fall into the sea from a massive earthquake along the San Andreas Fault at 9 a.m. on January 4th, 1973. Now, you see the great information you get from Murder Coaster? I was researching this one late into the night.
How do you stay up at night doing this research?
By drinking paranormal coffee. I prefer the Nightmare Fuel Blend. Dark is my heart. I hear Bram Stoker award-winning horror author Christa Carmen also enjoys paranormal coffee. Is that true?
You know it. But for me, it's the Omen Blend. My go-to for writing diabolical tales of terror.
And you can get yourself some paranormal coffee by going to their website, www.paranormalcoffee.com. And if you get a chance, follow them on Instagram.
All right, well, let me stop and take a sip of my paranormal coffee. Okay, back to our story. Well, Herb began to ponder the elements of the universe and his placement in it, finding great significance in seemingly random things. Like he was born on the day that Albert Einstein died, which was also the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake.
This led him to believe that he was intricately connected to both the 1906 earthquake and the death of Albert Einstein. There was a puzzle that he needed to decipher: a great natural disaster, a great mind, and death. What could the three mean?
Suddenly, it became clear. Einstein had died to protect all beings born on April 18th from dying in the Vietnam War, which was the great disaster of his generation. Einstein had sacrificed himself to keep Herb out of the war so that he could save the world from earthquakes by offering sacrifices to God. I mean, of course, it all made complete sense.
And now Herb had to sacrifice someone to stop the Great Earthquake of 1973.
As he'd later described this epiphany,
in the United States of America, 60 people die every day because a doctor can't get to them. You take all these deaths, the demographic data of Earth, break them down, and you take the seismic data, the number of earthquakes, their potency, the times they happen, the history of wars, and you can come up with a percentage that people have been steadily dying violently in order to prove to the great creator, who was the creator of the Earth and put it in orbit around the sun, just to prove to him that we're willing to die. We, Homo sapiens, we have found that murder decrease the number of natural disasters and the extent of their devastation.
And of course, he was all about the Bible. But while last week's Santa Cruz killer John Frazier was obsessed with the New Testament and the book of Revelation, Herb was obsessed with the Old Testament, of a wrathful God that would send destruction, floods, fire, earthquakes, and the idea of sacrifice and atonement.
The story of Jonah and the whale became the ultimate metaphor for sacrificing oneself to save the many. Though it's like really confusing how that story justified killing for earthquakes, and honestly, I'm usually really good at deciphering crazy. I mean, like, Charlie Manson makes fucking sense to me. But this guy was so far out, even I can't comprehend what the fuck he's talking about.
That's saying something. Herb headed back down to Santa Cruz, moving into his parents' house and acting crazier than ever, now 25 years old. Sometimes he would pretend to be a master of Far Eastern wisdom, wearing a Chinese farmer's hat and a tattered green bathrobe, speaking with an Asian accent. Other times he'd wear a black sombrero and speak in a Spanish accent.
He became convinced that an acquaintance's baby was the reincarnated spirit of his dead best friend, Dean Richardson. Which is, can you imagine having like some dude coming over to your baby and going, "It's Dean, Dean."
No, that's horrifying.
Yeah. He'd also berate his mother, telling her she should have told him about sex when he was a young child and vividly shown him how to masturbate.
Well, his parents struggled to find
Was that like
him
your worst nightmare? Can you imagine?
Yeah, it's like, good God. His parents struggled to find him any mental health help, as all funding had been cut by Governor Reagan. They didn't know what to do.
One day, Herb challenged his dad to a fight. And remember, his dad had been a boxer and taught him how to fight. And then Herb knocked his old man straight out.
It was a bad scene, man. Bad scene. But it was about to get worse. Much, much worse. Far worse than anyone could have ever predicted.
Chapter 3. The Murder Spree begins. New messages were coming into the mind of Herbert Mullin. He was like a radio transmitter, picking up frequencies far and wide. And these new messages were coming from his mother and father. They wanted him to kill for them. He had to do it. To be a good son, to be a loyal son, he had to save California from destruction. Had to stop the coming earthquake that Reuben Greenspan had predicted for January 4th, 1973. His father's voice echoed in his head.
Kill someone. Kill for me, son. If you don't, you will bring shame on the family. You will be nothing but a coward. Kill or get out. Kill or get out of my house.
The only place that seemed to quell the voices in his head was the mystery spot. That place of magnetic anomalies where up was down and down was up. Herb would go and sit in the little leaning shack and find solace from the barrage of voices arguing in his head. And interestingly, the mystery spot does not advertise that fact. You figure when you went on their website or went to there, they'd have a sign saying, "The only place in Santa Cruz that stopped the voices in serial killer Herbert Mullin's head."
For days, the voices taunted him. His father, with his military drill sergeant voice, demanding he kill to prove himself worthy, prove himself a good soldier, save California, save the world.
On Friday the 13th, October 1972, Herbert Mullin left his parents' house in Santa Cruz to return a library book, Einstein on Peace, 70 miles north in San Francisco. As he was walking out the door, he says he was hit by an overwhelming force of guilt and shame and grabbed a baseball bat, vowing to avenge himself and prove himself worthy to his father.
As Mullin drove north out of town along Highway 9 in his 58 Chevy station wagon, he saw a 55-year-old local hobo named Lawrence White, who'd just been released from 30 days of mandatory rehab. Herb said the man was the embodiment of Jonah from the Bible, and a telepathic voice came from the old man saying,
"Hey, man, kill me! Kill me and throw me over the boat so that others will be saved."
Herb pulled over, getting out of his car and raising the hood, pretending to have engine troubles. When the friendly old hobo strolled up and asked him if he needed any help, Herbert Mullin took the bat and struck him in the head.
As the old hobo fell to the ground, Herb continued to strike him with the bat, pummeling him over and over, cracking his skull open and beating the very life from him. When he was sure that he was dead, he took the corpse by the ankles and dragged it off the roadway. He then calmly got back in his car and continued up to San Francisco, where he returned his library book, A Meditation on the Ways of Peace by Albert Einstein.
Herb's mother had given him a book called The Agony and the Ecstasy about Michelangelo, hoping he could use art as a means of mental therapy. Little did she realize, this book would fuel his next incredibly horrific and brutal killing.
11 days after beating hobo Lawrence White to death, Herb was back in Santa Cruz, driving out to his old haunts, his old community college, Cabrillo, that he graduated from all those years ago.
That's when he saw devastatingly beautiful Mary Guilfoyle, 24 years old, who'd gone to the college for a job interview, hitchhiking, a broad smile on her angelic face. Herbert Mullin pulled to the side of the road and offered the beautiful young girl a ride.
Mary didn't hitchhike much, and when she did, she was very careful. But this guy was young, kind of looked like a hippie. He was even kind of cute. So she hopped on in to the stranger's car. And this was just an incredibly dangerous time to be hitchhiking in Santa Cruz, as infamous serial killer Ed Kemper was also picking up hitchhikers at the same exact time. It's crazy.
As Herb drove along Emmeline Street, the beautiful and bubbly brunette sitting beside him, he thought of the book about Michelangelo he'd gotten from his mother. His mind became fixated on how Michelangelo would actually dissect corpses in order to study the muscles and tendons, so he could understand the human body better and use that knowledge in his art.
Herbert Mullin, then, as he drove, holding the wheel with one hand, used his other hand to grasp his hunting knife and plunge it into the chest of Mary Guilfoyle, who slumped forward. Herb then sank the knife twice into her back before she slipped down onto the floorboards and died. Herbert saying that she voluntarily did so, trying to bleed on the floorboards and not the seats, offering him proof that she wanted to die, to be sacrificed, to save California from being washed into the sea.
Herb drove to Bonnie Doon, where his parents were living, and then out into the forest about a half a mile from their house, to a spot he went to gather firewood. There, he pulled her body from his car, took off her clothes, and, kneeling on the ground beside the corpse of the girl, he cut off her bra with his knife.
He then cut a T-shaped incision into her across the gut and up the chest, just as Michelangelo had done. He pulled her intestines free, then draped them across tree branches in what he saw as a form of art, then dissected her, slicing her liver and kidneys free, inspecting the organs, reaching inside her chest cavity to feel her lungs with his fingers before ripping her heart out of her ribcage, later saying that the gruesome murder was, quote,
an inquisitive response to literature.
Oh, man, fuck. He then stood up, drenched in blood, and looked at his work. briefly locking eyes with the beautiful dead girl who stared blankly back at him before getting into his station wagon and driving the half-mile back to his parents' home.
He began to feel remorseful for the murder of the beautiful girl, drinking to quell the pain, but alcohol didn't work. So on November 2nd, 1972, All Souls Day, he drove 20 miles north out of Santa Cruz to St. Mary's Catholic Church in Los Gatos, feeling he needed to confess his sins, hoping to find the, quote, strength to never attempt to kill again.
He entered the deserted church, desperate for salvation. It was eerily quiet and dark. The flickering votive candles, symbols of worshippers offering themselves up for others, casting ghostly amber light against the stone statue of the Virgin Mother.
As he walked towards the dark wood of the confessional, that sacred booth where one confessed their sins to God, a strange light began to emanate. The cabinet aglow and the voice of God descending directly from heaven and into the mind of Herbert Mullin, saying to him,
That's the person to kill.
Herb slipped his hunting knife free of its sheath, went to the door of the confessional, rattling it, but it was locked. The door then swung open, and there stood Father Henry Tomei, a 64-year-old French priest famous for his resistance efforts during World War II, who had founded 2 orphanages and played the church organ.
Mullin kicked the elderly priest in the gut, karate chopped him in the neck, then stabbed him in the chest, the blade sinking through the ribs and directly into the priest's heart. And as the priest slumped forward, Mullin stabbed him 3 more times in his back, penetrating his thoracic vertebrae.
The priest crumpled to the floor, turning onto his back and looking up at Herb, and managing to say, Bonjour, before he died.
Herb then went home to his parents' house and washed the blood of the priest off with a garden hose. And then came January 4th, the big day, the predicted end of California. And it came and it went, and San Francisco did not crumble into the sea. Reuben Greenspan claimed that he had gotten his calculations wrong, but Herbert Mullin knew different. He knew the true reason the devastating earthquake hadn't happened. His murder spree was working.
Oh, good God. Herbert then tried to join the Coast Guard, saying it was to fulfill his dream of swimming the English Channel, but failed the psychological test.
No shit. Really? Can you imagine that?
Struggling here. He then tried to join the Marines, even though he'd gone through hell getting his official conscientious objector status approved by the military.
And the Marines were actually ready to take him. They just wanted him to officially acknowledge and disavow his previous arrests. Just sign a simple waiver attesting to the crimes. But Herb refused to sign the waiver, saying when he'd committed those crimes, he was acting under God's commands. I'm really not sure how waving your cigarette burned dick around in public is following God's orders, and neither did the Marines. He was denied entry into the elite fighting unit.
After this, Herb's entire way of thinking began to change. It had to be a conspiracy that neither the Coast Guard nor the Marines would take him. Yes, there was a conspiracy against him, and it must be hippies and war resistors who were behind it. They'd brainwashed him, beginning all the way back to 1966, when he'd first smoked a joint on the beach with his friend Jim Gianera.
The evil, plotting hippies had plied him with drugs, talked him into being weak, into being a pacifist. He needed to take revenge on the dirty, no-good hippies who destroyed his life. Revenge!
Herbert Mullin then went to the Western Auto Supply store in Felton and bought a gun, an RG-14 22 caliber revolver.
Man, back in the old days when you could walk into an auto parts store and buy a gun. Though, liberal California, he did have to wait 48 hours to pick it up. They call that the neighbor law. So if someone decides to shoot their neighbor, when they go buy the gun, they have to wait 40 hours to think it over. Do I really want to shoot my neighbor?
Good God. 2 days later, Herbert Mullin returned to the auto parts store and picked up his gun, thinking, quote,
The flower children played tricks on my mind, and I have to reap my vengeance.
Chapter 4. I'll have my revenge. On January 25th, 1973, Herb set out to find his old high school buddy, Jim Gianera, who'd first gotten him high, offering a hit off that joint as they sat on the beach enjoying the sunset way back in 1966.
Jim had gone full hippie surfer, growing his hair long. He'd lived on the holiday commune for a while before moving into a cabin by the mystery spot, where he had a hippie party pad and sold weed to get by.
Herb drove out to the mystery spot and to the little cabin where his old high school stoner buddy Jim had been living. It was pouring rain, the redwood forest dark, dank, primordial.
He went to the door and knocked, but it wasn't Jim who answered. It was a young mother of two named Kathy Francis. Kathy told Herb that Jim didn't live there anymore, that he and his wife had moved to a house on Western Drive, and gave him the address.
Herb would say that during this exchange, he telepathically told Kathy that he wanted to kill Jim, and that she said that was fine with her and to get to it.
So Herb turned around in the muddy driveway and drove off into the pouring rain, driving straight to the home of Jim and Joan Gianera, knocking loudly on the door. Joan was upstairs taking a shower, and Jim answered, surprised to see his old high school friend whom he hadn't seen in years at the door.
Herb immediately screaming at him, saying,
I am extremely upset over the amount of time I have wasted in my life.
Jim told Herb he didn't know what the fuck he was talking about, then went into the house to answer the phone. When Jim hung up the phone and turned around, there was Herb, who'd followed him in and was now pointing a gun at him.
Jim bolted into the kitchen, taking cover by the refrigerator, opening the door to shield himself. Herb squeezed off his shot and hit Jim in the elbow, shattering the bone. Jim, howling in pain, then leapt at Herb, charging him, and Herb shot him in the chest, the bullet piercing the ribcage and puncturing Jim's lung.
Jim fell backwards, then lurched up the stairs, desperate to warn his wife Joan, who'd just gotten out of the shower.
As Jim reached the top of the stairs, Herb shot him in the back of the head, Joan opening the bathroom door to see her husband crumbling to the ground, blood squirting from the hole in his skull.
Then Herb shot Joan in the chest and she fell to the ground, inching toward her husband, her final words, I love you, before Herbert Mullin took his hunting knife and plunged it into her back, then stood and shot her 3 more times in the neck.
Herb then began thinking of the mystery spot, of that cabin out there, and that woman Kathy, who had given him Jim's new address. Kathy knew too much. She knew he was coming there. She could turn him in. So Herbert Mullin closed his eyes and reached out telepathically to the woman, whom you may remember he'd had telepathy with earlier that day. He asked her telepathically, Kathy, would you mind if I came over there and killed you and your 2 sons?
Kathy replied back to him, Sure, come on over. I wouldn't mind at all if you killed me and my 2 sons. That would be fine.
So Herb got into his station wagon and drove out into the pouring rain, the fog seeping down from the ancient redwood forest, out to Mystery Spot Road, up through the massive trees and into the mist.
Herb pulled up to the little cabin in the forest of giant trees, like something out of a fairy tale, and strode up the front steps and right through the door, surprising Kathy in the kitchen washing dishes. He said to her,
"I'd like to have a few words with you."
And before she could answer, he shot her in the chest, shooting her again in the head as she fell to the floor. He then walked up the stairs of the little cabin and into the boys' room, where David, 9, and Damon, 4, were lying in the top bunk of their bunk bed playing Chinese checkers.
Oh, man. Playing Chinese checkers with your brother on the bunk bed on a rainy day. How wholesome can you get? What a fucking nightmare.
When David looked up, Herbert Mullin shot him right through the eye, then shot his brother Damon in the head, then stabbed them each once in the back, before going back downstairs and stabbing Kathy once in the chest as well.
He then strolled out the door to his station wagon and calmly drove away, back into the pouring rain.
Later, when asked how he could kill 2 little children, one only 4 years old, he would say,
"Well, I believe in reincarnation. You know, those kids, just think. They're out there somewhere, fishing."
Ugh, what a fucking douche. Chapter 5, Inspiration Point.
Okay, when you read about this part of the story or watch documentaries, they always describe Herb's next victims as children camping in the woods. But this is not true, and we're going to give you the real story. Remember, this is the level of research you get when you listen to Murder Coaster. They were not local children camping in the woods at all.
As you may remember, like John Frazier, Herbert Mullin also spent a lot of time hiking in the redwoods of the Santa Cruz Mountains. And often he went out hiking to places where he knew hippies gathered.
Yeah, by this point, Santa Cruz had become a meeting spot for freaks the world over. A place to meet up on the way to somewhere else, or a place to just chill out for a while, which it actually still very much is. There's all sorts of little hippie camping spots hidden about the Redwood Hills, some of them secrets that are traded amongst friends. I myself actually know where there's a sweet hollowed out redwood tree, perfect for a couple of tired hippies looking for a place to crash for the night. And we also used to camp on the beach there at Greyhound Rock. I remember insane parties there between Grateful Dead shows. Like the entire parking lot filled with vans and school buses and VW buses. Crazy scene, man. Crazy.
In the 70s, there was a place in Henry Cowell Redwoods State Park where hippies would meet, hang out, and crash above Inspiration Point in the San Lorenzo Gorge. This spot wasn't actually part of the park itself, and visitors weren't allowed in that area. It was about 3 miles south of Felton on the upside hill of Highway 9. And you had to hike up to it to get to it. Vehicles couldn't get there. It was extremely remote and hidden.
So hippies had made this crazy tent thing there. There's pictures of it. I'll post them. It looks kind of like a big circus tent. Big old thing with a wooden floor made out of branches and thick industrial plastic sheeting. And the only way to get into the tent was through this crawl space that you had to crawl through to get in. Different people had lived there at different times, sometimes as many as 5 people. But on February 10th, 1973, there were just 4 people crashing in the hippie tent.
One was a 15-year-old runaway from Pennsylvania named Mark Drebelbus. He'd gotten busted in his hometown, the Pennsylvania chief of police saying,
"We took enough marijuana and hashish out of that boy's bedroom to fill a station wagon."
So, God bless his juvenile delinquent soul. He ran away to California to live on the beach. You gotta love it. Just 15. And that was the 70s for you.
You have to stop and think, though. In the 1970s, all these teenagers are getting killed by serial killers in their hometowns. You got John Wayne Gacy in Chicago, Dean Corll in Texas, among so many others. And when questioned, they all claimed the teenagers had run away to California. Even Pee Wee Gaskins told police that 2 of his victims had run away to California. But now you have a kid who did, in fact, actually run away to California. And what happens to him when he gets there? Spoiler alert, he gets killed by a serial killer.
70s were kind of fucked, man. The other 3 in the hippie tent were 18-year-olds David Oliker and Rob Spector, who were actually Southern California college kids, friends who'd met up in Los Angeles and then started backpacking up to Oregon for a little adventure. They were just passing through Santa Cruz. David was an English major at Valley Junior College in Van Nuys, and Rob was actually starting school up here where I am in Humboldt County at College of the Redwoods.
David and Rob had been brought up to the spot by their friend David Scott, 19 years old, a local hippie who was living in the tent at the time.
When Herbert Mullin came across them, he says his first thought was, wow, human sacrifices.
So scary. There was a .22 rifle sitting there outside the tent. It had actually been stolen at some point and changed hands a ton of times before it ended up at this hippie camp, where it was going to be used to hunt small game for food. None of the 4 kids squatting there at the time had even used the thing.
Herbert Mullin grabbed the rifle and then crawled on into the hippie tent. The kids were all like, hey dude, what's up? You want something to eat? You know, it's a communal hippie pad after all. I'm going to guess that they were burning either Nag Champa incense or sage, maybe both. And there were tapestries hanging up, a battered old AM radio playing rock and roll music, a pipe made out of a deer antler. I don't know, that's what my mind conjures in this scene at least.
So Herb put the rifle down and sat in a circle with the youths, eating with them. They all told Herb where they were from, what their stories were. David and Rob told him how much fun they'd been having camping as they traveled up the coast from Los Angeles headed to Oregon. As they talked, Herb would later say,
there were 2 different dialogues, the external one and the internal one. And the internal dialogue told me they wanted me to kill them. Something told me, if those 4 didn't die, then 4 others would. It was the first time I had ever spoken at great length to persons who were going to give themselves up by a sacrifice. So I telepathically told them, if I don't kill you, 4 other guys will have to die. And they telepathically responded, go ahead and kill us, man. You know, just go right ahead. Please don't back out of it. Don't get scared, man. We're not scared.
Herbert Mullin then became very serious, very stern. He looked at them and said,
you will have to move from this government property.
Echoing what forest rangers had said to him before when he'd been caught in these very woods.
Herbert Mullin then pulled out the .22 revolver he bought from the auto supply store and shot Mark Drebelbus right in the forehead. The bullet, like a movie, going right through his head and exiting out the backside. He then turned and shot David Oliker in the hand as he raised it to defend himself, then firing again. The bullet entering David's head, causing massive and fatal brain damage, before he turned the gun to Robert Spector, shooting him in the head as well, and then firing 2 shots at Brian Card, one going through the nose and another into the cranial vault.
In an instant, all 4 boys were dead.
And it's crazy. Can you imagine that moment of pandemonium in that little hippie tent? Whew. Herb then rifled through their meager belongings, coming up with $21. He then took the camp .22 rifle, and strode away out into the shadows of the ancient redwood forest.
Chapter 6. Busted. Three days after executing the 4 hippie youths in the redwoods, Herb was lazily driving his station wagon through town after filling the back with firewood for his parents, when he spotted an elderly man named Fred Perez raking leaves on Santa Cruz Avenue by West Cliff Drive.
This guy was a bit of a legend, a beloved old man who seemingly everybody in Santa Cruz knew and adored.
Fred's family had actually come to Santa Cruz in 1796. His wife's family had come to Santa Cruz in 1850, and he would tease her and call them short-timers.
Here's some cool history. So in the 1800s, Santa Cruz was populated by Italian fishermen from Genoa, Italy. But right down the road in Monterey, it was all Sicilian fishermen. And apparently, even in this new world, these ancient Italian rivals stayed separated and had their weird beefs going on.
Fred had been born in 1900.
Can you imagine the changes this man must have witnessed in his 73 years? It's fucking nuts.
No, and when he was 12 years old in 1912, he'd drive a horse and buggy to the wharf, fish all week, then drive the fish to Capitola and sell them to tourists.
That's some old school shit there. And when World War I broke out, Fred joined the Marines. After his service in the military, he moved to San Francisco and started boxing, becoming the middleweight champion of Central California. Then he returned to Santa Cruz and went back to his family heritage of fishing. He loved the ocean. He could be seen clamming and diving for abalone. I love abalone. You ever eat abalone?
I don't know.
It's actually a snail. It's a sea snail. It's a snail that lives in the bottom of the ocean stuck on a rock.
Yeah, I don't think I have.
They're kind of endangered. You're not allowed to sell them commercially. You have to go get them yourself or know someone who got them. They're really good.
Wild. That's
you
good.
Beat them with a bat. Yeah, it's this
big,
huge hunk of gooey flesh, and you gotta beat it with a bat to get it soft, and then cook it on the barbecue. It's really good stuff.
Jeez. So Fred retired from the fishing industry in 1969, but kept a job delivering fish every Thursday, saying he just wanted to stay in touch with his friends.
So Fred is outside his house, raking up leaves in his yard, and along comes Herbert Mullin, driving his station wagon down the road.
That morning, Herb had gotten a telepathic message from his father, saying,
"We need you to bring home firewood, and you better shoot somebody before you come home. If you don't, you'll shame your parents. Remember, you've got to save the San Andreas Fault."
So he pulls over and lowers the back window of his station wagon, then climbs back, laying on the firewood he'd collected, aims the .22 rifle he'd stolen from the hippie camp at the old man raking leaves, takes a breath, holds it, squeezes the trigger, and sends a bullet square through Fred Perez's heart, killing him instantly. He then calmly climbs back into the driver's seat.
A neighbor heard the gunshot and went to their porch to see Fred sprawled out dead on his front lawn, and a blue and white station wagon with an STP sticker on the right fender slowly pulling away.
A BOLO, or Be on the Lookout, was issued for the station wagon, and Super Cop Sean Upton of the Santa Cruz City Police thought to himself, okay, the shooter is probably heading out of town. Officer Upton ran through the possible ways out, remembering there'd been slides that morning closing Highway 1 in San Mateo County, so he figured the shooter would be leaving through the Mission Street bypass. So the policemen headed there and parked, waiting and watching.
And sure as shit, here came a blue and white station wagon with an STP sticker on the fender, pulling off Mission and onto Highway 1. Officer Upton pulled the station wagon over, radioing for backup, then using his megaphone, ordered the driver out of the car and to the ground.
Officer Upton handcuffed him, and as he pulled him to his feet and led him to his patrol car, Herbert Mullin looked at him and said,
"I want you to observe my constitutional rights."
Inside the car, lying on the floorboards, was the .22 rifle he'd just used to kill Fred, and a fully loaded RG-14 .22 caliber revolver with the serial numbers scratched off.
Later, there would be conjecture over the fact that Fred had been a boxer, like Herbert's father and Herb himself. Could the elderly man have been a symbolic stand-in for Herb's own father? But when asked if he knew Fred had been a boxer, Herb said no, he didn't know that. He just shot him because his father had telepathically ordered it be done to save California from earthquakes.
In just 4 months, Herbert Mullin had murdered 13 people.
Herb was brought to the detective bureau and asked if he knew why he was there. He replied, "I have a right to remain silent on advice of my attorney," which is absolutely true, and actually a good move for anyone.
So the detective asked who his attorney was, and Herb just sat there, stubbornly silent. So they asked him if he wanted to make a phone call, and he replied,
"Silence!"
They again asked him who his attorney was and if he wanted to call them, to which he replied,
"Obviously, you guys don't know what silence means."
Herb then called his mother and asked her if she liked her Valentine's Day gift, then asked to speak to his father, simply saying,
"Would you call Mr. Pease?"
and hanging up. When the detectives asked him if Mr. Pease was his attorney, he yelled,
"Silence!"
Herb then said that the sergeant was now responsible for the 3 million people killed in World War II, before requesting that fingerprints from all unsolved crimes since 1925 be compared to his father's. The request was denied.
Herb was assigned a psychiatrist, Dr. Lund, who would spend more than 100 hours interviewing him and would later write the book, The Die Song, about it.
Herbert told Dr. Lund this.
"You know, the coastlines on all continents are protected through the result of a minor natural disaster. In other words, we human beings through the history of the world have protected our continents from cataclysmic earthquakes by murder."
Lund replied back, "But if murder is a natural disaster, then why should you be locked up for it if it's natural and has a good effect?"
Your laws. People like to sing the die song. I can sing the die song to them and they'll have to kill themselves or be killed. An automobile accident, a knifing, a gunshot wound. You ask me why this is and I say, well, they have to do that in order to protect the ground from an earthquake because of all other people in the community have been dying all year long. We have to die also, and people would rather sing the die song than murder.
Herbert Mullin also confessed to the murders of Mary Guilfoyle, Lawrence White, and Father Henry Tomei, which law enforcement had no idea he'd been behind.
His father hired him a lawyer whom he fired, saying at one point it was because the lawyer had long hair and looked like a hippie, and at another point that he didn't want his father paying money for his own defense. So he was given public defender James Jackson, the same man who had defended John Linley Frazier and would go on to defend Edmund Kemper. Crazy.
Mullin originally pled guilty, but the judge himself changed his plea to not guilty. His public defender demanded Herb plead guilty by reason of insanity, although Mullin did not agree, saying he wasn't insane, that he was doing God's work.
Trial of Herbert Mullin would begin on July 30th, 1973, and be the first trial in California history where the question of insanity was put to the jury during the actual guilt or innocent phase of the trial. You may remember John Frazier's insanity trial was held after he'd already been convicted.
But as obviously delusional and psychotic as he was, The jury had to deal with the McNaughton standard, which states that if a person knows what they are doing is wrong, that's all that matters, no matter how delusional they're thinking.
Which made Herb very, very guilty, as he'd hidden things, retrieved bullet casings, and even killed witnesses, all trying to not get caught, proving he knew what he was doing was wrong.
Herb then dramatically demanded to take the stand against the advice of his lawyer. This is what he said.
Every hour people die. There is a steady flow of death in order to keep the coastal areas free of cataclysmic earthquakes and to keep the Earth in orbit. I'm just like everybody else. I want to be worth something. 90% of the world has practiced killjoy sadism against me. My basic contention is that my former family and former friends played a game of killjoy sadistic witchcraft upon my mind. They caused me to become a paranoid schizophrenic, and then they caused me to commit the 13 mass murder crime spree.
While Herb claimed his father had commanded him to commit the murders telepathically, he did admit that he had the power to ignore the messages, saying he was not his father's robot or under hypnotic control.
Herbert Mullin explained how he had proof that these murders had been ordained by God using numerology, in particular the number 13. He had committed his first murder on October 13th, his last on February 13th. There were 13 victims, and therefore he was the 13th disciple of Christ.
It all makes complete sense if you think about it.
The defense pointed out that he'd been entered into mental hospitals 5 times, and every single time he'd been diagnosed as a schizophrenic. But that didn't prove that he didn't know what he was doing was wrong, which was the crux of the law.
The jury deliberated for 14 hours, and on Monday, August 20th, 1973, gave their verdict.
Herbert Mullin was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of James Gianera and Kathy Francis, because their deaths were premeditated. This would ensure he'd never leave prison. But he was only found guilty of second-degree murder on the other 8 counts because the jury found his diminished capacity limited his ability to premeditate.
And though he confessed to their murders, he was never tried for the death of Mary Guilfoyle or Lawrence White, because besides the confession, there was no other evidence tying him to the crimes. Later, he'd be convicted of Father Henry Tomai's murder in a Santa Clara County trial.
In 1980, Herbert Mullin was eligible for parole for the first time. He was still completely unremorseful, claiming he'd been commanded by his father to commit the crimes and that he'd saved California from devastating earthquakes, saying he'd just been doing God's work. Unsurprisingly, he was denied parole. He'd be denied parole 7 more times, and on August 18th, 2022, Herbert William Mullin died from natural causes at the age of 75 while housed at the California Healthcare Facility.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Santa Cruz serial killer Herbert Mullin. But the story of Santa Cruz is far from over. For next week, we take on the most infamous of all the killers who made Santa Cruz, California, the murder capital of the world.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Be sure to tune in next week as we turn to Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world. And if you want to say hi to us, reach out at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week.
See you.